to take a moment to remember Dick Gottschalk. He passed away a few days ago, as you know. He was a model citizen of this town, a really fine teacher, a prolific writer of wide interests, and also a regular participant in the philosophy forum, both as a presenter, but also always ready with questions that were both probing and generous. And in this, as in so many other ways, he was an example to all of us and has left us with an obligation that we should try to meet. And I'm sure he would have been delighted to see you all gathered to welcome Professor Woody Holton. He is Associate Professor of History at the University of Richmond. He has revived and enlarged an important question about the social circumstances of the founding of this country and the Constitution. He will talk about this issue more broadly this evening at 8 o'clock in the University Theater, when he will speak about unruly Americans, the social conditions of
that would have been even better, but and the origins of the Constitution.
The origins of the United States Constitution. This afternoon, he'll talk about a vignette in this broader scope, and it is about Abigal Adams' entrepreneurs, or entrepreneur.
I've changed it, so it doesn't matter. I'll give you a new title.
Entrepreneur.
Correct.
Please join me in welcoming Professor Holton.
Well, I really appreciate the invitation, and I'm going to look forward to talking about my old book tonight, but this is a part of my next book, which is, I was telling some of your colleagues at lunch, it's already up on Amazon, so you can go ahead and put in your Christmas orders if you want, but I haven't finished writing it yet, so it's a strange position to be in, but it also means that the fun part of this afternoon is that I'm open to suggestions, and so I've been asked to about split the time 50-50. So what 40 minutes will make it about 50, about 150. By then, if I haven't stopped talking, stop me. Is that right? Yeah. If I haven't stopped talking by 3:50, I mean, then stop me, because I really want to hear your thoughts. I gave Richard the title Abigal Adams Entrepreneur, and that'll be part of what I'm talking about. But let me give you a new title, which will become clear in due course, which is simply My Will. And let me start with Abigal Adams' will, which she wrote on January 15th, 1816. She was 71. She had a serious illness that she thought was going to be her last, that she was pretty sure that she was dying. So she sat down on the morning of January 15th of 1816 to write out her will. And she gave away her watch and a silver tankard and an enormous number of gowns and money for people to buy mourning rings, which was the tradition at the time, but also $4,000 worth of bank stock, back when $4,000 was a lot of money. A $1,200 bond, and that's not just some random IOU, that was as good as gold, and 7 shares of stock in companies that ran toll bridges. So a pretty substantial amount of personal property that she was bequeathing. 2 extraordinary things about that inheritance that she left. The first is that she had 20 heirs, and 18 of them were women. Only 2 men that got anything, a tankard to one son, a share of stock, a few little things, were her 2 sons. And all of her other 18 heirs were women. Granddaughters, nieces, a couple of the servants who had nursed her, daughter-in-law, cousins, so forth. And it's not like there weren't men. For instance, she had a son named Thomas Boylston Adams with 6 kids, and she gave stock to his 2 daughters, but nothing to his 4 sons. And so that's one thing that I'm interested in and that I want to explore and that hasn't been discussed about her before. But the other much, in my opinion, more extraordinary thing about Abigail Adams's will is the fact that she wrote it at all. Because in January of 1816, as she would be in October of 1818 when she died, she was married. And under the prevailing law of the time, we call it coverture, as a married woman, she was a femme couverte. She was covered by her husband. She could not control real estate. She could own real estate, but her husband had full control over it, got all the profits of it. So she couldn't control real estate, but personal property, which included everything I just listed. The dresses, you could make a case that's personal, but all the money and the stocks and the bank share and the canal shares and so forth, all of that stuff, she's not allowed to own that. And so that's why the vast majority of women who were married at that time left no wills. And I asked Ken Lockridge if he'd ever seen a will written by a married woman. And of course, he's the one person in the world who could say yes, that he had. But I think he's the first person who's ever answered yes to that question, because it's a very rare thing. So that leads to several questions that I want to ask. One is why? Why did she write a will when she really, under the laws of the time, was not supposed to? Where did she get all this money that she was distributing is another question. I've already mentioned, why did she give almost all of this inheritance to women? She said in the first line of her will, I, Abigail Adams of Norfolk County in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, by and with the consent of my husband, do bequeath all of this property. So, and she actually didn't at the start of the document use the word will. So in a sense, she's actually acting as her husband's agent, or so she claims, which I emphasize because his name is not on it. She claims to be acting on his behalf, and so if she's right about that, then this is an extraordinary act of hers, but also a collaboration with her husband John. And you guys know about a lot of collaborations of Abigail's and John's, but this one that's never been reported before, to me, is the most amazing of all, if it's true that she really had gotten his consent. And to know that, we'll have to know something that she never knew, which is what happened after she died. Did her husband actually carry out her will? And I'll make you wait till the end to find that out. But to try to answer these questions, I want to run through some key moments in her life that I think will help us understand how it is that she came to basically defy the law of coverture that said she wasn't allowed to own personal property. Her husband went off to the First Continental Congress in 1774 and put her in charge of the family farm and the finances, and would come back a little bit while he was in Congress, but then in 1778 he went off to Europe and didn't return for 10 years. And so she was in complete control through all that period of the farm and what to do with the family savings and so forth. While he was in Europe as an American ambassador, you know that he negotiated peace with the British along with some other guys. She was entitled to some of his salary. You know that you would do that. You would send part of your salary if you're a Mexican migrant worker in Montana. You send some of your money back to your wife or husband in Mexico. Same deal. He sent some of the money home, and he said, "Well, the way I'll do that is I'll send you. You draw a bill of exchange on me. It's like a modern bank check." But Abigail had a better idea. She said, there's a war on, and European goods are in great demand here in Massachusetts, particularly things the ladies like. Handkerchief, gauze, linen, little decorations, flowers and things to put on your dress. The price of those has gone through the roof because so little of that stuff is making it through the British attempt to blockade the Atlantic Ocean. So she said, send me remittances in that form instead. Now, we've always known that John was sending her stuff, but we hadn't known the extent of what he was doing it because he always referred to these shipments as articles for family use. But I took one of these inventories of what he was sending over and just a little spreadsheet saying, okay, well, which of these items that are clearly sort of retail, you'd want one of them, and then which are these things where, 10 bolts of linen, and huge amounts of things, and 80% of the value, that's the one invoice that we have where we have actual numbers, 80% of the value of what he was sending over was not for family use, it was for her to sell, even though he had described it as for family use. So I think that term family use was a ruse. Perhaps to prevent privateers from seizing that stuff. If a privateer is a government-sanctioned pirate, and so if a ship is going across the ocean, a privateer can seize it, they get the ship and its cargo, but they generally allow the captain and crew to keep their own personal luggage. And so I think he was disguising this stuff as luggage. But the result of that is that we've way underestimated the extent of this import business that Abigail and her husband were running. She proposed the idea shortly after he arrived in Europe, and he initially went along with it, but then immediately got cold feet and was worried that he was going to pay all this money for things in Europe, and then they were going to be captured at sea. But she wrote him back saying, you can kind of hear her saying the first part of this, and then I'll quote the second part. Don't you get it? And the quote is, if 1 in 3 arrives, I should be a gainer. She understood that the prices were so high that she could take a few losses and the whole thing would still work. So he continued the shipments. And then another little difference between these two business partners who are also romantic partners was he wanted to send her small shipments. And every time somebody going over, at this point he was in Paris, and so he sent over something with the Marquis de Lafayette. But did you know that Lafayette went home every winter during the Revolution and sort of took the winters off to go home? And so he gave Lafayette a few handkerchiefs and lace to take over. And he said, that's how I'll get stuff to you. And he was spreading his risk. He was much more risk averse than her. She once quoted the expression to him, nothing ventured, nothing have. But that was not his attitude at all. He was really trying to prevent risk. So he said, let me do it that way. Rather than send you big shipments like that first one from Barcelona, I'll send you a little. And she goes, no. The problem is if you do it that way, you're going to be buying retail. And that's going to cut into our profits. So buy wholesale, take the risk of sending large shipments. And he went along with that as well. So in this import business that she was running, you can see her really asserting herself and gaining her self-confidence and also gaining this extra money that's going to eventually evolve into the money that she gives away in contradiction to the law in her will. One other fun thing to say about her import business, she and John had been having an argument over whether to buy a new, help me with the pronunciation, chaise. It's a two-wheeled carriage. Not as big as the big, horse that's pulled by the one that's pulled by 6 horses or whatever. Would you say chaise or chaise?
I say chaise.
Chaise, all right, then it's chaise. And she wants to buy one. He says, oh, prices are way up because of the war. Let's hold off. And I can't believe the extortionate prices. She used her profits from this retail trade to buy a new chaise, and so there was nothing he could do about it, and nothing he could say. In the fall of 1781, the Massachusetts legislature had taken the state back on the gold and silver standard, meaning that you could no longer foist paper money on your creditors, something I'll talk about tonight. And so she then felt safe taking some of this extra money that she'd made in her trade and investing it. She put it, as she explained later to her husband, in the hands of a friend. She pointedly didn't name that friend. I think it was probably her uncle Cotton Tufts, but we can't say for sure. But I think this was a gradual step towards her declaration of independence with this money. That is, of her on the road towards her declaring this money to be her own. And after she reported to John that she'd lent this money out, he wrote back saying, "Don't trust anybody. Don't trust money to anybody." And she could have pulled that money back in, but chose to quietly defy her husband's instruction on that. Well, in 1783, John had signed the preliminary peace articles with the British at the end of the previous year. It was a matter of form to settle things, and he thought he was coming home soon. So he wrote Abigail saying, it's time to start buying a lot more land. He'd actually been paid quite well as ambassador, and wanted to really build up his farm. And she did that and started buying little bits of land here and there. There was one farm owned by a family named Vesey, though, that would have been much more expensive. And she didn't have the money in this money that he'd sent her. She didn't have enough money to buy the Vesey farm. But here's what she wrote him at the end of December 1783. If, my dear friend, you will promise to come home, take the farm into your own hands and improve it. Let me turn dairywoman and assist you in getting our living this way instead of running away to foreign courts and leaving me half my life to mourn in widowhood. If you'll do all that, she wrote, then I will run you in debt for the farm. I'll run you in debt to buy Vesey's farm. Now, that's quoted by almost all of John's and Abigail's biographers because this notion of borrowing money, they were both very averse to debt. So the fact that she's proposing to borrow money is big news, and so it's always reported. But they don't report whom it was that she wanted to borrow that money from, that she was proposing to borrow that money from. Do you know who it was? Herself. When she said, I'll run you in debt to buy the farm, what she was really saying is, I will lend you the money to buy this farm if you'll come home, and not if you, and she says, if you don't come home, this is a deposit I do not choose to touch. So it was a bribe. But again, the laws of the land say she, as a married woman, can't own property. All of any property she would claim is actually his property. So she's offering to bribe him with his own money. John did not come home in the spring of 1784. In fact, instead he told her it was time for her to come on over and join him in Europe, which she did for the next 4 years. And so she did not buy the Vesey farm. She actually was a little suspicious of this whole idea of buying the Vesey farm, as I'll say in a minute. But I want to take you forward to the spring of 1785, after she has joined him in Europe there at Auteuil, a little town outside Paris, which I've horribly mispronounced. Anybody want to help me? A-U-T-E, Auteuil. Her son, John Quincy, who'll be president many years later, is coming home to get ready to go to Harvard. And she sends a letter with him to her uncle, who's taken over her role as the family's business agent in Massachusetts, and says he's going to be bringing with him, let me get the exact sum, 50 pounds worth of Massachusetts currency. A laborer might make that in 2 years. And she says, with this money, which I call mine, I wish you to purchase the most advantageous bills and keep them by themselves. The most advantageous bills. What she's referring to is war bonds. You know about Daddy Warbucks, who owned all these bonds in Little Orphan Andy? You own savings bonds. These are not bonds, though, to be bought from the government. These are bonds that have been previously distributed to the soldiers who've won the Revolutionary War, but they're basically IOUs. And if you're a soldier and you got to get home, you can't eat that IOU. You can't wear that IOU. And what the soldiers did was dump the bonds, sold them to speculators at a fraction of their face value. And so they're now trading as a commodity, and speculators are buying up those bonds. And so she was instructing in that letter to Cotton Tufts, instructing her uncle to buy her one of those bonds. And so Abigail Adams has now become, having been a merchant, having been a shrewd investor of that first, fairly safe investor of that first 100 pounds, she's now a bond speculator. Something that her husband abhorred. He would say a year later in a letter to Thomas Jefferson that bond speculators were nothing but Jews and Judaizing Christians who are trying to, shockingly enough, John Adams was an anti-Semite. It was the feeling of most Christians at the time that Jews are bondholders and all that. And when he said that in 1786, this anti-Semitic comment about bondholders, not only was his wife one, but he was one, because by that time she had also convinced him to go into the business of being a bond speculator because the profits were too big to pass up. The reason they were so big is that you buy these bonds at, say, a fourth. She bought some cheaper than this, some more, so I'll take a mean. So you buy them at a fourth of the face value. The interest is 6%. The interest is figured not on what you paid for it, but on the face value. So where's the math major who can tell me I'm paying 6% of the face value, but I got it for 1/4 of the face value? What's my annual return on my investment? Close to 30%, 24%. Which, if I could make 24%, I'd be a happy guy, and that's what she was doing. In the fall of 1784, going back a little bit on the bond speculation, John had decided to go ahead and buy the Vasey farm. He now had enough money to buy it on his own, and so he wrote Cotton Tufts a letter saying, buy the Vasey farm. 3 days later, she wrote Cotton Tufts saying, I know John has written you telling you to buy the Vasey farm. Don't buy it. And Tufts didn't buy it. And it took a few months for John to figure out what had happened, so he wrote another letter in April of 1785 saying, buy the Vasey farm. It says that on the front of the letter. If you flip that letter over, John Adams writes, shewing what I had written to Madam, she has made me sick with the idea of buying Vasey's farm. You will take that 200 pounds sterling and buy me more bonds. And so I really, if I could go to any moment in American history, maybe it might be them, to see, did she look over his shoulder? He actually was later in the practice of giving his letters to her to sort of review before he sent them out. So that had probably already begun then. I don't know how she found out, but in the middle of that letter, she convinced him from being a medieval owner of land, with his rural acres, to being a modern bond speculator. What was she using this money for at the time? She explained to Cotton Tufts when she said, buy this bond, set the money aside separately for me. She said, I'm going to use this to establish a fund for my pensioners. And it took me a long time to figure out who her pensioners were. But they were widows and other poor people, almost all of them women and mostly widows who lived in her neighborhood. The one about whom I have the most documentation, actually, her name is Phoebe Abdy. And 2 years before Abigail started giving her little firewood here and a little cash there, 2 years before that, she had been owned by Abigail Adams' father. She had been a slave until 1783 when the Supreme Court of Massachusetts abolished slavery and he freed her in his will. And so Phoebe was one of the recipients of this charity from her. She helped out both of her sisters. Her sisters were both very poor. One married a preacher and the other married a philosopher, and with the inevitable results. But let me say a little bit more about Phoebe, because Phoebe first shows up in her records in 1785. 1786, Phoebe shows up in the records as a problem, because in addition to giving her firewood and stuff, Abigail has put Phoebe in charge, basically house-sitting the Adams home while Abigail is in Europe. And she's taking great care of the house, no problems about that. But she has been allowing, quote, straggling Negroes to stay in the house. That is, people more desperate than themselves. And Abigail, through her agents, her sister and her uncle, say, you may not do that. I'm willing to have you stay there free, but not all these people that I don't know. And I never have a verbal response from Phoebe. I don't have any letters from her, although she was literate. But I do have the fact that the next year they're once again complaining that Phoebe is putting up people. And actually by 1788, I think it is, she's also accommodating white as poor as black, as well as poor black people. And that controversy continues at least up until the year 1800. So for 14 years, Abigail is telling Phoebe, you cannot let these people stay with you. And Phoebe is saying, I'm going to do it, by her actions saying, I'm going to do it. And I just think it's interesting that one of Abigail's pensioners has pensioners of her own. Okay, I want to continue following this process and focusing on the bonds. As I'll talk about tonight, the U.S. Constitution finally arranged not only for paying interest on the bonds, but sets it up that the bonds are going to be redeemed, and that you've been making 24% interest on your bond. Now you're going to have this bond for which you may have paid $25 redeemed at $100. but James Madison got in the way. He initially was a good friend of the bondholders for reasons I'll talk about. But by the time he had to face the voters to get elected to Congress, and his state doesn't have a lot of bondholders, he turns against the bondholders. And he wants the bond speculators who currently own these bonds to split the money 50-50 with the soldiers and the farmers who actually did the work and supplied the livestock and other stuff to the army. The 50-50 split. Well, the vote on Congressman Madison's proposal was on February 22nd of 1790. That, by coincidence, although she had been the vice president's wife for almost a year, that, by coincidence, was the first day that Abigail Adams went to the gallery of the House of Representatives to watch the vote on that. Not to say that she had let anybody know that she was one of the bondholders that was affected by it, but she knew which day she was going, and she was happy to see that the vote was 13 votes in favor of Madison's proposal and 36 votes against. And so the bondholders got all of the money and the soldiers and the farmers got nothing. Now I say that she didn't announce at the time that she was one of the bond speculators. She's actually making a great effort at this point to conceal the fact that she owned these bonds. And I'm intrigued and mystified, and maybe some of you guys will have ideas about this, because John Adams made no effort to conceal the fact that he owned bonds, even though he did cast several votes, deciding votes in the Senate. You know, the vice president cast deciding votes on a tie. He cast several votes in favor of the bondholders, but he didn't try to conceal the fact that he owned bonds. But she did. She wrote Cotton Tufts, her agent, saying, "Can't you conceal the name by making yourself signing as a trustee?" And he said, "No, that's not going to work." And so he actually ended up signing as a receipt for her bonds as Cotton Tufts trustee for Mrs. Adams. So I'm intrigued about why she would try to conceal it and he wouldn't. I think it's because, which is my big theme today, I think it's because she didn't want to reveal that she was owning personal property in defiance of the law. But Tufts, having signed this for these bonds as her trustee, is actually, I think, significant that he used that word, because there was a loophole in the theory of legal coverture that prevented women from owning and controlling property. Abigail never used this loophole, but I think she sort of started modeling herself on it, at least by 1790. The loophole was this. A man gets ready to marry a woman. She can demand what today we call a prenup, or he can demand a prenup. But in that case, it would be her who demands it. And that does allow her to own and control property, not directly, but through a trustee. Some other man, her brother or whatever, would become the trustee of this fund that would control property. That was mainly done to protect a wife's property from her husband's creditors. If he's irresponsible and he might lose all the money, then she's going to put her money aside. It was very rare, especially rare in New England, where it violated the Puritan notion of a man and woman as one person. Well, let me go ahead and say that actually both of her sisters ultimately did it. Her younger sister lost her husband at a pretty young age, and before she remarried, she'd inherited a little property from their parents, and didn't get to control it until her husband died, wanted to keep controlling it, even though she has now married a new husband, and she requested and he agreed to sign a marriage settlement. And her other sister, Mary, the one who'd married the philosopher, at some later stage, I don't know the exact date, I don't think I ever will, at some point, but we know it was before her death because it's mentioned at her death. She also had a marriage settlement. So Abigail had the example of her two sisters demanding marriage settlements. There was another kind of example that Abigail was operating off of as well, and that is the notion of pin money. So some of you may have heard that expression, pin money. It's just sort of your walk-around money used to buy pins. But by that time in England, it had acquired a sort of a legal standing, so that even though a married woman was not allowed to own personal property, her pin money she was entitled to. And cases had come up where women had collected pin money from their husbands every month, sort of like an allowance, and then accumulated, invested it, and they had been allowed to keep it. And she did refer to this stash of hers as her pin money. In a letter to Mary, Mary wrote her in 1789 saying, look, my husband really needs a job with the government. Your husband is vice president now, and your husband can get my husband a job. And Richard Krantz had never succeeded at anything. He was a thinker, not a doer. Now, if you study technology, you can do both. But he was a thinker and not a doer. And so she knew that he'd be disastrous and be bad for the whole family. And so what she said, I can't do that. It's impossible. John has no patronage power, which was not really true. He had lots of influence. And so she said, what I can do, though, is I can forgive a debt. Mary had borrowed little bits of money from Abigail over the years, and she said, figure out how much it is that you owe me and send me a total, and I'll send you a receipt, and the debt is gone. And she said, I can do this because it is, and this is a quote, that's my own pocket money. So pocket money is a little bit like pin money. She later used the term pin money. But in both of these cases, when she used the term pocket money in the letter to Abigail, later she used the term pin money in the letter to her son, Thomas. Both of these times, even though she feels entitled to the money, both of these times she says, don't tell John. She went through this very elaborate procedure with Mr. Adams, of course she would say. Very elaborate procedure with Mary, where John was in the habit of reading Abigail's mail. And so Abigail, but he didn't read his daughter's mail. So Abigail told Mary, send a letter to my daughter, and then inside that have a letter to me that you tell me how much you owe me so that I can send you a receipt and clear the debt. But there was a third letter covering both of those two to John, because letters to the vice president paid no postage. And she wanted to take advantage of the Franklin privilege. So it took 3 letters inside each other to do it, but she put her pin money to pretty good use there. Well, let me take you all the way back to the date that I started at, January 15th, 1816, when she wrote out her will. She did not say in the first sentences, Abigail Adams, sound will and body, being of sound mind and body, and do write this last will and testament. But it's interesting, if you look at the last page of the document, it's pretty clear that she sort of took a breather. Remember, she's sick, and put down her pen and came back to it. And when she came back to write out those last few paragraphs, she went, before continuing, she went to the middle of the line and wrote the words, my will, and then continued to write out her bequest. I think her reason for giving most of the money in that will to her female descendants and servants and so forth, rather than to say her grandsons or her nephews, is that she wanted to give them, to the extent that was in her power, she wanted to give them the same, the opportunity to do what she'd done, which was to have property that was her own in defiance of the law. I'll say one more thing to take you forward to her death. She died of typhus fever on October 28th of 1818 at the age of 73. I found just enough pieces of paper to say with confidence to you that her son Thomas, who was actually starting to fall into alcoholism, but whom she'd named as the executor, she didn't use that word, but to carry out her will, and so there was a danger that he would drink up her fortune or something like that, but he didn't. He complied with it. Her son, John Quincy, and her husband, John, all participated in carrying out her wishes to the letter. The one person who somewhat, to some extent, and you can tell me how you evaluate this yourself, somewhat defied her wishes was her daughter-in-law, Louisa Catherine Adams, the wife of John Quincy Adams, with whom she'd always had an up and down relationship. Abigail left her $150. Louisa Catherine took $75 for herself, but took the other $75 and split it among her 3 sons, all of whom, as you know, had been excluded from Abigail's will, and made a point of saying to Thomas Boylston Adams, the administrator, that they're more deserving than I am. So I end with a question: would Abigail have felt like Louisa Catherine has violated my intentions by taking this money that I meant for her to have and instead giving it to these young men? My answer to that is no, for this reason. By deciding on her own authority to give that money to those boys, Louisa Catherine affirmed something that Abigail had been fighting for her whole life, and which the law denied her, and that was that the money was hers to give. Okay, I'm done. So let's talk. Thoughts and questions? Yes, sir.
Before the 19th century, households were important economic institutions, and they couldn't be run unless there was a division of labor and responsibility between, a man and a woman, a husband and a wife.
Right.
And to what extent was the personal power of a woman in relation to her husband more important and gave her more authority than her legal status would allow her?
I think it's a great question. Everybody heard that, didn't you? Did anybody? The one thing we can say for sure is that there was much more variety in what really happened on the ground than what the law allowed. The next thing I'd say is echoing a comment of Laurel Ulrich, who's one of the great historians of women and gender of this era, and that was that women had a lot more a lot more responsibility than they did power. And so the first part of what I've talked about today, Abigail running the farm and managing the family finances and all that, nothing surprising about that. She was in very good company in that respect. But I would say, A, that there was tremendous variety, and B, that it might even be fair to say most, or to be safe, a great many households, I think this is what you're implying with your question, the woman actually had a lot more influence than she did power. That is, if push ever really came to shove, her husband can go, "You are my wife, goodbye, city light," that he was the ultimate authority. But the cost of exercising that ultimate authority was so great that few men ever did. So that every time I talk about this, I think my initial specialty as a historian was slavery. And a lot of these same things, technically a slave never left the plantation, technically slaves didn't get married, technically this, that, and the other thing, none of which was true on most plantations, that all those things really did happen. So I think that analogy is helpful. So not a lot of power, but yes, a lot of responsibility, and in many cases, a lot of influence. I'm avoiding Richard for the moment. He knows too much. Am I not the only one who does that?
Did John Adams leave a will, and if so, who were the recipients of it?
Oh, that's a terrific question, which I should have said. He did, and he left his books to he had 2 sons by that point and no daughters. His daughter he had a premature son die of alcoholism. But I should say that son's alcoholism was a family thing. Abigail had lost a brother to that as well. But this had really been sped up in the case of Charles Adams by his utter failure as a speculator. And his daughter had also died of breast cancer. Her husband had also been an utter failure as a speculator. All these people around Abigail. It's a reminder that speculator is a fair word, that it wasn't like she had insider information and everything was a sure thing. There were risks involved, and all these people failed. But to answer your question, so John at that point had 2 sons, and the short answer to your question is he split everything equally between the 2 of them. Now, Thomas, his alcoholism was now acting up, and so his half of the property was put in a trust to be managed for him out of fear that he would dissipate it, as his uncle and brother had done. But I think the important thing is that John used the rule of math. That is, 2 sons, each of them gets half of it. and not. And there was a little bit, I forget, I don't have the notes with me. There was a little bit to the grandchildren too, but it was all sort of straightforward, equal division, and not, he was not picking and choosing. And this is consistent with one case that I know that's pretty far from Massachusetts, but at about the same time, a woman named Suzanne Lebsock wrote a book called Free Women of Petersburg, about Petersburg, Virginia, near where I'm from. And she found that difference in men's and women's wills in general. That is, that men tended to follow some concrete rule. Everybody gets half, or whatever. I mean, everybody gets their 10th, or whatever. Whereas women tended to pick and choose and say, this person is more needing, this person took better care of me, and so forth. And certainly that rule that I get from Lebsock operated within the Adams household. Yes. And then let me go to you, and then I was going to go to Lori for. All right, let's. No, I went to Lori and then Ken.
Yeah, you guys did.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to follow up on the point you made earlier that Abigail had set up pensioners, and then the former slave had continued the pension work. After she died, what happened with that process? Did her family continue any of that care for the poor and the widows?
After Abigail died? I don't know. I would assume that Louisa Catherine and John Quincy were able, being able did. You can answer that for sure?
Well, I think it's a very good question. Can I piggyback here? Look, just as her investments begin to grow, and there's a prospect of very significant growth, three things happen. One, she justifies it in terms of pensioners, of whom, as far as we know, there was one. Two, she falls on these legal straws, the trustee, the pin money. And these come at the moment when her fortune becomes substantial. She's acquiring a sense of power. She feels guilt. She needs to justify it, and she wants to solidify it legally. It's a pattern. And this all seems to me, I know you've worked with Laura Ulrich, and I wonder what she says about this, because her article in a collection called Through a Glass Darkly, she's speculating about women passing on furniture decorated by women in memory of previous women in the family, right? With great aunt so-and-so's name and accomplishments painted on the furniture through their husband's wills, but with a kind of understanding that there is a consistent female line of inheritance. So I wonder if Abigail isn't doing two things. One, morally justifying with all this pensioner thing, which may be a fiction, protecting legally at the same time her growing fortune, and also trying to do what previous women did, pass it on entirely to women, but to make this visible and legal. So Laurel surely must comment on these issues.
Yes, and I should fix one thing that you picked up from my leaving out information. I do know some of the other recipients of her firewood and stuff, so she definitely did use some of her money to give charity, not only to Phoebe, but to other women. But your larger point is absolutely right, that she did sometimes refer to this stash as something that would help pay her son's tuition at Harvard and so forth. But clearly, she had picked up enough of John's abhorrence of bond speculation that she felt the need to say, I'm not speculating in bonds for me, I'm speculating for Phoebe and all these other widows and orphans and so forth that I'm helping. So that's absolutely the case. And then I'm really intrigued by your other question of her legal justification by referring to it as pin money and I don't think she was, and you didn't say this, but just to try to help me think it through, she wasn't like trying to lay down a sort of a paper record that would be available if she and John ever landed in court together. But in a sense, it was sort of a moral / legal justification. That is, she was getting her arguments together if John ever said, look, I'm in trouble, or I really want to buy the Vesey farm, so I need you to hand over that money.
John died first.
No, she died first.
No, but if John...
Oh, if John died first. Oh, yeah.
If John died first, what does she have to establish her claim?
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. If John dies first. Now, under the law, she gets a third of his personal property. No, this is Massachusetts. She doesn't get any of his personal property.
The use of a third of the estate.
And it's a third of the real estate she gets to use. But in Massachusetts, personal property she gets Z. So if all he owns is stock, she gets nothing. I mean, that's only if that's what he's required to give her. He can give her everything, but he's not required to give her anything on the personal property side. He's got to let her use a third of his real estate.
Does he get ill? Does she correspond with him at any time when he's quite old and ill? Can you reveal it?
No, I'm going to make a note of that and look into that because I mean, you know, they both go through periods when they think they're going to die. And
This is fascinating, actually.
some of
I'm
this,
not criticizing in any way.
is prep for if JA dies first. And I had not thought that through at all. So since he didn't, I hadn't thought about it. But it certainly was a it was a good possibility the whole time. So thanks. Any thoughts? Yes. Oh, and then Richard. I mean, yes. One more behind you, and then I won't be able to avoid.
I want to ask a couple of questions for clarification for myself. Those bonds that the speculators were buying up, were they intended to be paying interest ad infinitum, or did they ever mature?
The short answer is there was an amazing variety in different kinds of bonds issued in different states. There were often bonds issued to pay interest on other bonds. And so the note that I mentioned, her buying in '85, after Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts reduced tax collections, there was massive tax resistance going along with that, and they stopped getting that interest rate for a while there, which is one reason those bondholders, as Richard knows, got interested in the U.S. Constitution, because the U.S. Constitution enabled Congress to redeem the state as well as the federal bonds. And so, short answer is there was a huge variety of different kinds of bonds, and some paid interest in some way, and some had termination dates, and some didn't. Some just said she'll pay 6% interest until redeemed. And some states managed to redeem their bonds. Massachusetts was one of the states that was famous for not redeeming its bonds. Virginia, where I'm from, what they did was tax the bonds back in. And so that means if Ken has been a soldier fighting in the Army, and Richard has not been fighting but is a taxpayer, then he's got to pay a $100 bond as his taxes this year. He goes to Ken and they work it out. You know, he buys that bond from him and then uses the bond to pay his taxes. So Virginia, through that method, was able to get its debt down significantly. And that's why in general, the southern states didn't want the federal government, after the Constitution was adopted, to assume responsibility for paying the state debts. But states like Massachusetts that still had these huge debts did want the federal government to pay it, and they did. So if that's prefacing something else, I better let me go back to you, because it's you'd have to ask me about a specific thing, because some were redeemed, some weren't. Some had a redemption date and that they just ignored because they couldn't pay it, and then continued paying interest until the feds finally came in and swooped them all up.
Well, it wasn't really prefacing anything. I just wasn't understanding that in reading your book, because it sounded like they could be drawing interest on it forever and still be holding the principal that was, you could cash in for full value.
Yes, and that's the way you said it is exactly right. Even if the bond had a termination date, if the government violated its part of the contract by not redeeming it on January 1st, 1785, then it was understood that you'd continue to get your 6% interest until the government did its part by paying off the principal.
Okay. Well, now the other thing I wanted to ask you was, how did she dispose of those wholesale shipments she received from John?
Oh, that's a great question. She did not retail them out of her house in Braintree. I think it would have been considered. Now, there were lots of women merchants at that time. And there's a great story, actually, that she related in a letter in 1777 to John before he went to Europe, about women merchants rioting in Boston because the coffee wholesaler wouldn't. He was holding on to his coffee until the price went up, and that has previously been reported as a sort of caffeine addicts riot. You know, we need that coffee, but it was actually women merchants who needed it for their stores, who rioted and forced him to give up that coffee and left money. So they weren't thieves; they were rioters. There's a distinction, so there were lots of women merchants. But I think she felt, as the wife of a diplomat, which is a you're representing the United States to royal courts, it would be undignified for her to sell the stuff directly. So she sent some of the stuff. Cotton Tuft's son had gone into trade, and so she hired him as a consignment merchant, like a consignment shop today. But he just got a percentage. The risk was hers and the profits were hers. And she also sent some down to her friend Mercy Otis Warren, the famous penwoman of the Revolution, who wrote a lot of plays and poetry and pro-revolution and then anti-constitution essays for the newspapers. But Mercy Warren also didn't sell it. She had her son as kind of a front man. He was 15 years old as fronting the store. So yeah, she didn't sell it directly. I'm glad you asked that because I didn't remember to mention that.
After such a build-up, I'm embarrassed by the innocuousness. I'd like to go back for just a moment to Unruly Americans and then ask a question about Abigail. When I put your book down, when I came to the end of it, I developed a very negative impression of the bondholders. It seemed to me that they constituted the first PAC or pressure group or lobby in American politics, and through their manipulations, left American democracy thwarted and maimed. Abigail Adams was a bondholder. And so my question to you, Woody, is the story that you tell about her one of triumph regarding the advancement and liberation of women, or is it one of tragedy, which really underscores the deeper fact that in her story we find an example of how women selectively from the elites were being let into the capitalist hegemony, which would continue to maim American democracy through its elitist maneuvers? Tragedy or triumph?
Definitely both. I have to say, this is the first time I've really been talking about her property ownership, but I've been talking about her bondholding on John's behalf for a long time. And I always expect my audiences to be appalled and, oh, this is horrible. And they invariably go, you go, girl! And so it really, it is both, because she was both an exploiter and an exploited. And that's the biography that I hope to write. That is a biography of a woman who is neither, no, I was about to say who's neither a hero nor a victim, but she's both. She has a better answer to your question than I do. Please. Different subject. Well, let's see if anybody, this is supposed to be a seminar anyway. I want to get somebody else, but don't forget yours, but let's see if anybody else wants to get in on Richard's question, because I think it's a great one.
Well, to answer his question, don't you have to have a sense of the overall propriety of guaranteeing those bonds? Alexander Hamilton is seen as the central figure in the move to pay off the bonds.
Correct.
And he certainly has his defenders.
Yes.
So.
Yes, well, and that's what I think that what makes it a good seminar question, because we could disagree.
So the question is, was it good for the country to pay off those bonds in the way that it was done? Right.
And many people do make that case, that if the bondholders hadn't been there offering, I'll give the case of Joseph Plum Martin, and some of you may have read his memoirs, which are a really fun read and only about $6 on Amazon. And no, he doesn't give me a cut. But he was a Revolutionary War soldier who fought for most of the war and was at some of the most famous battles. And his memoirs are a lot of gallows humor and all that. But at the end of the war, only time he'd gotten real money, gold, in those days gold and silver coin were the real thing. Continental money, the expression not worth a continental, was basically worthless. And the one time he'd gotten real money was when the French army, they were going through Philadelphia, and the French army said, let's pay the Continental Army their monthly salary for once. And that's the only time he'd gotten real money. All the other time he'd gotten paper money that was virtually worthless. So they gave him bonds at the end of the war to compensate for the fact that they'd basically been giving him worthless money during the war. And those bonds, he doesn't give in his memoirs the exact figure that he got, and it varied by soldier, but he said that he sold those bonds He was on the Hudson River near Newburgh, New York, at the time, not far from West Point. He said he sold those bonds for just enough money to pay for a suit of clothing and the food that he needed along the road to get home. So he had fought in the Revolutionary War for 7 years for nothing. For nothing, he'd been paid nothing. He'd fought for something, but he'd been paid nothing.
I think also at the end, I teach that regularly, he is bitter, as I recall, not only about the fact that the actual soldiers who fought through the revolution no longer get the glory of it,
Right.
the politicians, the stay-at-homes, but I think he makes one remark that indicates he's bitter about the bond issue.
Oh, he does, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, he's very bitter about that.
So it remains for years. This is
Yeah,
30 years later.
The memoir, when he writes memoirs on like 1830 or so, I think.
Yeah, I still remember, more than 30 years later. A related question. I'm very interested in that chaise or chaise that Abigail buys. Is there a lovingly detailed description of it, and is it emphasized that the old one is shabby and Massachusetts built? Remember when they finally furnished Monticello, Jefferson's home, with its original furnishings a few years ago, Gary Wills went in and was shocked to the core at how imperial these furnishings were, and what absolutely imperial stuff in France, and furnished his house at the top of this great hill in indeed imperial style. Is this an imperial chaise? Are we moving up socially?
Yeah, they're definitely moving up. There is not a description of it. In fact, in the letter that specifically she announces to John that she went ahead and bought it with her own money, quote unquote her own money, she doesn't even use the word chaise. We know what she's referring to from previous letters that set that up and later letters that talk about it. What she refers to it as the you-know-what.
Oh, here we go, more guilt. He's guilty about the bond investment, she's guilty about the chaise. What is interesting, she is a little different, you're right, she's modern. Land, as you say, the medieval thing.
Right.
It's not her, she's a typical Massachusetts aristocrat.
Yeah, this is the most
A little
intriguing.
distance, but you're aiming for the same style of aristocracy as the British landed aristocracy.
This is the most exciting thing, most fun thing for me to talk about, and then I have not really talked about on paper and probably won't because it's too speculative, but it's a fun thing to talk about in a seminar. That is that her status as a woman in some ways prepared her to be more modern than John as a man. And the key word here is virtue. He defined virtue in the ancient way, and that is a virtuous politician is a man who owns sufficient landed property, like a Roman senator, sufficient landed property to ensure his economic independence, which therefore is a foundation for his political independence. And it all depends on how much land you own. He has some of that pastoralism that Jefferson is famous for, those who labor in the earth are the children, or the people of God, or you know what I'm talking about. Are God's chosen people. Those who labor in the earth are God's chosen people, if ever you had any. And so you might say he gets some jollies just from owning land. It has an economic value to him in that you can rent it out and get some money from the tenant. But it has a much more important cultural value to him because it makes him a Roman senator. It makes him agricultural and in touch with the earth and all of that. She, on the other hand, cannot own land. Now, she cannot control land, and she can't buy land. She inherited land, but she can't do anything with that land. She has no control over it. She doesn't get the profits from it. She just gets it after her husband dies. She actually gets it when she dies. That is, she can determine who it goes to. Most women didn't bother to write wills, even for the real estate that they were allowed to own. They just let it be divided equally among their heirs through intestacy. But my point is, she can't have the joy of owning land. So for her, what matters about an investment is not how much virtue it gives me, it's the rate of return. And she says to him, Massachusetts land is paying 1% return a year, and the bonds are paying, the ones I'm referring to in this comparison that she made are 18%. So she can say bonds while he's saying land, and can't we then take that to say she's more modern than him, and she's able to be more modern than him because she's a married woman and he's a married man. Richard.
Woody, can you tell us something about her religious sensibilities? Because as I listened to you this afternoon, I kept thinking about Max Weber's Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, and how in his famous image, the iron mask of capitalism becomes the substitute religion for the Puritans and their descendants for traditional Puritan theology and Christianity.
Yeah.
Where is she in that spectrum of sensibility from the Puritan past and the materialistic future that Weber describes?
Right. Well, you'll have to come back to me with what Weber would say when I tell you this. She was very anti-Calvinist. And
Anti-Puritan.
no, she would call herself, I mean, she already had sort of a nostalgia about the Puritan ancestors.
But what's the basis of
I don't know that she ever called herself a Puritan, but hardly any Puritans ever called themselves Puritans. She's a Congregationalist. She goes to church twice every Sunday, and quotes the Bible more than anything else, and sees disasters in religious terms. I had a student write a wonderful paper about how she sort of evolved in the. She first saw the Revolutionary War as a divine scourge punishing people like her, punishing Americans for their sins. So that's the Puritan Jeremiah tradition, right? God's punishing us just as Jeremiah knew that God was punishing the Israelites. And so that makes her very much a Puritan. But then at the end of the war, she makes a point of saying American independence is a plant not watered by the showers of heaven, but by ourselves. That is, God didn't give us our independence, we took it. Which I think is kind of a ballsy thing to say. You expect lightning to come for one thing. And then when the Unitarian controversy breaks out in the early 19th century, she says unequivocally, I am a Unitarian. So I'm trying to think how Max Weber is going to be useful to think about her. He will be, but I'm not. But I'll come back to you with thoughts about how.
I'm very interested in her economic investments as
Yes.
a way of life.
Yes.
And see them as an illustration of his thesis.
Right.
Put her right there with Franklin.
Yeah. Even though she's an anti-Calvinist, even despite what I said about her being an anti-Calvinist.
Well, I mean, Franklin was an anti-Calvinist too, but came from a Puritan background. He was born in Massachusetts.
True, of course. Oh, good point. Okay. Did anybody else want from? Let me go to her because she had one for a while ago that she might forget, and then back to Ken.
Going back to the pensioners and the freed woman, what was her name, Penny?
Phoebe.
Phoebe.
And by the way, I should tell you that she was never referred to in any letter. Abigail mentioned her in maybe more than 20 letters. Never called her anything but Phoebe, even though for most of that period she was married to a man named William Abdy, and all the other women in her, a few exceptions, all the other married women are Mrs. Adams. Her own daughter is Mrs. Smith. She never referred to Nabby as anything but Mrs. Smith from the day she was married till the day she died. But of course, Phoebe was always Phoebe. Anyway, go ahead.
Well, so you said Phoebe brought people in to sort of share the wealth with them while they were passing through. It reminds me of a paper I just read about Jim Crow in Montana in the territorial times, before statehood.
Wow.
And, the researcher makes the point that, uncovered the evidence that even though there were some pretty well-to-do little pockets of African Americans living in Montana in the territory in early statehood times, they not only had really strong family values, solid families and high morals, and the women didn't work if they didn't absolutely have to, but the rich people always gave money to bring the poor people up. Mm-hmm. They always shared the wealth. Mm-hmm. And so her practice of doing that and insisting on doing it for 14 years reminded me of that.
Yeah. I think that has been part of that cultural, obviously nothing racial about it, but there is a cultural tradition of which is certainly not limited to African Americans, but I know people in Richmond who would be a lot wealthier if they would just get rid of that silly notion that you got to look out for your relatives. And so the key reason I'm stuttering is that you don't want to say African Americans believe or African Americans do and sweep from Montana in the 1880s to Virginia in the 2009 to Massachusetts in 1780. But I take your point. Ken, did you want back in?
Well, I was just to put notes to Richard. Actually, Mark Valeri's done some very nice articles that make it very, very clear that the Puritans were not barbarians, in the sense that what haunted them, the New England Puritans, and there's so much evidence, I could do a whole course on this, so much direct, clear, compelling evidence, that they were unbelievably guilty about economic success. They sought in every way they could for 2 generations to suppress excessive profits, to repress people who were economically aggressive, both men and women. And this, Mark Valeri's latest article shows that this continued well up into the 1670s and 80s. They were not hypocrites, they were haunted.
Right.
Some of
that totally fits it. Mark is my good friend and almost next door neighbor, and I hadn't thought about using his work, but you're absolutely right.
It's good work.
Yeah. Huh.
I don't think it's left.
Yeah. So you still see some guilt up there. Yes.
I have 2 questions. First, I'm wondering whether there was anything irregular in the way the merchandise was being transferred from Europe to the U.S. It sounds like a diplomatic pouch.
Oh, funny you mentioned that.
So I'm wondering, were any rules or laws being broken in those transfers? And if there were, would the Adamses have been aware of that?
We know once that it was. Or no, I shouldn't say that. We know that she wanted it to be. She said to John, when you're sending your diplomatic correspondence, why not, these are not these little 8.5 by 11 envelopes, so these are big packets. She said, why not throw in a few ribbons and stuff for me, and that way you don't have to pay any postage, since that stuff travels for free. So she was definitely abusing, if you want to put it in modern terms, that opportunity. And I gave you one example of her using John's franking privilege. She was not notorious, she should have been notorious for this. If you're a friend of hers, and you're a friend of hers living on the other side of the country, you're in New Hampshire and you're in Georgia, and you want to write her, that's going to be expensive. So she says, look, just write John, and then John will open the letter, and it will be addressed to me, and I'll open it and see that it's for her, and then get John to enclose it in a new letter and sign that with his frank and send it off to her, so you pay no postage. But the government's got to pay for it to come here and there. So she was ruthless about exploiting the Franklin privilege. I only know about once on the international side, but right up until her death, she was helping out her friends by freely offering her husband's signature on their mail, and which today would put you in jail if they enforced it. But I look at that not so much as an ethical breach, because I think people were expected to help themselves out a little bit. You're not paid.
It was seen as a perk.
It was a perk to be broadly exploited, I guess. The thing that's clear from that is, and there's infinite evidence that she always had, as Maggie Hogan, who's the editor of the Adams Family Correspondence, says, a sense of entitlement. That is, and you can kind of see, Richard, if I can take a positive perspective on Abigail, she did give up her husband for a good chunk of their adult life, all the way to Europe for those 10 years. She's with him the last 4, but she did do a lot for the country. She felt like the country was ungrateful to her. And so I'd say this is, again, one of those moral justifications, Ken, for her abusing the franking privilege and for her willingness to do this horrible thing, bond speculation, which she understood to be a crooked thing. Not crooked, a sleazy thing to do. Because you and I could argue whether Hamilton's a good guy or bad guy. They thought bond speculation was a sleazy thing to do. And I think she felt that was justified because she was trying to nudge her family's compensation closer to what a grateful nation would have given them.
yeah, I mean, the old socialist cry that aristocracy is theft is borne out by the detailed history of the creation of any aristocratic family in Europe or here.
Primitive accumulation.
Yeah. My point is that, and it has been in almost all my work, that the establishment of aristocracy in a place where property is relatively widely distributed, colonial America and early America with a legal tender act, is all the more difficult. So what he's doing is using the diplomatic pouch. He says my family because he's abusing the diplomatic pouch. That's why he says that. That's to keep it within the concept of the diplomatic pouch. But you're not supposed to use the diplomatic pouch for massive wholesale shipments that will profit your family.
That may not be fair to him because a lot of these shipments he's sending, they might be fair to him. More than because you know the notion of diplomatic pouch was not there. I mean, it was true that the ambassador's mail went freight free. So you guys may be making a point there.
They have to do it because you know what's happening with the aristocracy. There's a legal tender act in Massachusetts too. All the money you have out at interest at the beginning of the revolution is paid back to you in toilet paper by the farmers who owe you money.
Right.
Because the revolutionary paper money, which is not even good for toilet paper, they're allowed to pay you back in that. Until you know you've beaten the British and got control of rebellious American society again, then you stop the legal tender acts and you have hard currency again. But in that period of the 1770s and early 80s, when there are legal tender acts, many of these families, like Carroll's in Maryland, a third of their estate is out in loans. They're money lenders. They're the banks of the age.
Right.
And that's very unseemly in aristocrats, of course. And it's out in rents, too. Well, they can't collect the debts because of the legal tender acts. They can't collect the rents because you don't collect rents from the militia when they're saving your ass from the British. And so the construction of gentility becomes a real problem. So there's this precious moment when the legal tender act is ended. You're regaining control. You can buy a fancy French chaise. You see what I mean? There's this. It's a problem. And stretching the diplomatic pouch or the diplomatic franking privilege then maybe is part of that. Constructing aristocracy is always shabby, and it's especially shabby in America. It isn't just Puritan conscience. It's aristocratic conscience. I want people to know how I got there. You know, Ron's book on the Carrolls is full of this.
Right, yeah.
So here's my second question. You've told us about the economic details of her will. Is there any moral component to her will beyond what's implied in the economic? Sometimes in wills, people express their wishes about what will happen or how they will be remembered or things like that. Sometimes they exhort their heirs to be virtuous.
Yeah, the son who was had the drinking problem. None of that. You're making me make a note so I can go make sure that I remember that right, but I'm pretty sure it's a pretty straightforward. And I will say there is an endorsement on it that says Abigail Adams' distribution of her property. And I'm still trying to figure out, I'm going to Massachusetts in a couple weeks to get help on this, whether that's her handwriting or somebody else's. Abigail Adams' distribution of her property. I think it is her handwriting, and so I think she saw it as only that, and not as a will in that other sense. But I'm glad you asked me that because it helps me think about it. You know, what does that mean? What are the implications of that? Does that mean her claim was less, the defiance that she was exerting by writing a will, was it less so if all she was doing was distributing property? Would it have been a more outrageous thing to do if she had done all the things that men do in will? Do you see what I'm saying? Or how do you read that?
So, sometimes even the economic details tell you something morally. Washington wanted to provide for the care of slaves, and I think also the education of some of them.
Right.
And then the legislature, after his death, forbade the education, according to Gary Wills.
Yeah, I don't know about that, but obviously the main thing he did, of course, was free as many as he could, but also providing for them.
But it went beyond that.
To educate, yeah. And let's just sure mess that up. Is that in Negro President? Is that in the book Negro President? You think that's where you know that? I'll have to look into that too. let me make a note about this. Did she do anything non-economic in her will? And as you say,
So you've identified the desire to help women in
Yeah.
her family.
yeah,
That's clearly a moral impulse.
that's right. Even if all you're doing is distributing property, that's a moral thing.
Right.
No question.
And then I'm wondering if there were any other moral
Well, yes, within women, for instance, now that you mention it, it's the second thing you said, that, she doesn't have anything that's totally non-economic, but some of her property distribution, for instance, and this might actually go back to Ken's guilt issue in a sense, and that she leaves a disproportionate amount, the $1,200 that she leaves. I said it was a bond for simplicity's sake. It's actually money that she'd lent to her son, John Quincy, and he'd paid back a bunch of it and offered to pay all of it. He was able to pay all of it back by now. And she said, no, I don't want it. I want you to continue to owe me this money. And then she turns this promissory note over to her niece, who was named Louisa Catherine Smith. She had lived with Abigail and John since she was a child, and she's now an old lady herself. But she lived with them and never married, lived with them her whole life because her father had drunk himself to death. And so his family had been distributed among his family, among his sisters and so forth. And so Louisa by far got the most property from Abigail, more than her nieces and grandchildren. And Abigail worried that the others would hold it against Louisa, that she got so much more than them. And she wrote in there urging them not to do so, that Louisa needed it more because she didn't have any other relations to take care of her. So that definitely has a moral component to it. And it's something I don't mention in my book, and I think maybe I should. Thanks. Yes?
Alcoholism is ruinous today, but it's not ruinous because alcohol is so expensive. Was it different at the time? Was alcohol ruinous also because it cost a lot of money to buy?
I think the answer to that is no. Kyle and Ken might have thoughts about that. I know that alcohol consumption in general was about double in 1800. Well, my students are always surprised to hear this. It was about double in 1800 what it is today. Our students think that they drink more than anyone has ever drunk or ever could drink, but it's actually it's way down. And so from that, I infer that it was not. I don't think the cost was a big issue then. That you could get New England rum, pretty cheap. I hadn't thought about it. I think the way that alcoholism ruined her brother and her son is that it kept them from working and made them do stupid things like her son Charles did crazy speculations and he messed up his brother John Quincy. John Quincy gave him a bunch of money to invest. That's probably why Abigail had to lend money to John Quincy, is that he was in the hole because his brother had messed him up on bad investments. But I don't think the cost of the liquor. I hadn't thought about that, and so I'll have to look into it, but I don't think so. And we're out of time.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.